You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
But tonight, we're continuing in our walk through the book of not Ephesians, wrong book, the book of Ecclesiastes. And in Ecclesiastes, this is actually our second to last sermon as we have walked through almost the entire book at this point. And if you've been here, I hope that this has been as much of a blessing for you as I know it has for me. I mean, this book is so refreshing, and I think we're going to get to taste some of that freshness tonight as we're just reminded again of who God is and of the reality of the world and what that means for our practical lives. Over the past couple of months, we've actually talked a lot about the fact that God is in control of everything, right? That He's in control of everything, and that when we recognize really how in control He is, it exposes our delusion of control. Right? I talked about this just a few weeks ago, about how God is sovereign over all of life, and that life, therefore, is not just a system we can manipulate. Right? It's not simple enough for us to figure out and kind of make happen. But we still operate with this delusion of control, assuming that maybe we control, or maybe wanting to control more than we actually do or we actually can. Right? We want to believe that if we eat the right things and exercise the right way, that we can control our health. Right? We want to believe that if we make the right financial decisions, we'll never be in need. We want to believe that if we parent the right way, our kids will turn out the way we want. But the truth is, we don't ultimately control these things. As we saw in Ecclesiastes, we can't make straight what God has made crooked. And at the same time, we can't make crooked the things God has made straight. We can't take credit for the physical health we have now. It's been a gift from God. We can't take credit for the different financial blessings we have because they're from God. We can't take credit even for having children at all, let alone what they're like. But recognizing that we are not ultimately in control, I think, is one of the greatest blessings for the crooked parts in our lives. Because without it, we're riddled with anxiety. We're riddled with guilt. We're riddled with discouragement because we think that we do control these things. And so if life's crooked, it's because of us. It's because of all the things, all the wrong decisions we've made and the wrong turns we took. And we're going to talk about those decisions tonight. But the crooked parts of life, the uncomfortable instances of suffering, the detours that we didn't expect, aren't ultimately the result of failures on our part. They're part of God's good and sovereign plan for each one of our lives because He is in control. But I think the problem is, though, that when we take away this illusion or this delusion of control, it leaves us struggling to know exactly how to make decisions. Right? I mean, because we're so motivated by this concept of control, right? The idea that we're in control is what gives us the kind of tells us what to do, tells us what decisions to make, and really determines a lot of the motives for our life. Right? The reasons we work as hard as we do is because we think we're in control. The reasons we sacrifice for what we sacrifice for is because we think we're in the control. The reason we make the choices we do is because we think we're in control. But what do you do when you realize you're not in control? Like how do you make decisions if you're not in control? If this is ultimately not up to you, how do you even navigate, and what motivates the decisions you make? These are the questions we're going to see addressed in our passage today. And so our passage is Ecclesiastes chapter 11. And it starts with at the very beginning of chapter 11 and goes through verse 8. The preacher of Ecclesiastes says this. He says, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of the God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. Light is sweet, and it's pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. This is the word of the Lord. So what do we do when we realize we can't figure out life? Like how do we make decisions when we realize we don't control near as much as we'd like to think we do? And the preacher, I think, here provides us with three really actually simple instructions for navigating life in this world where God is in control. And these are the three instructions we're going to look at tonight. Number one, he says, don't be afraid. Number one, don't be afraid. Number two, just do something. And number three, and enjoy life. Don't be afraid, just do something and enjoy life. It's actually really, in a lot of ways, really simple. Well, it's simple theoretically, but we find it oftentimes the hardest to really apply. See, we've all experienced that paralyzing fear that comes from knowing that we don't control the future. Right? Because when you don't control the future, every big decision brings out this fear. Right? It's this fear of what if I make the wrong choice, right? And every big decision at any stage in life, this fear just comes welling up again and again and again and again, right? The decision of what college to go to, or the decision of who to marry, or the decision of how to educate your kids, or the decision of whether or not to take a job offer, or the decision of whether to move to Los Angeles, or the decision whether to move out of Los Angeles. Life is just filled with these decisions, and we get paralyzed because we think, what if I make the wrong choice? Right? I mean, these are big decisions that have major consequences. Like, what if I go to the wrong college? What if I marry the wrong person? What if you homeschool your kids when they should have, or they would have been better off in public school? Or what if you send your kids to public school when they would have been better off homeschooled? Or what if you take the wrong job? Or what if you turn down the right job? Or what if you move at the wrong time? Or what if you move to the wrong place? I mean, just think about all that affects. Think about all, and our minds, I mean, just our imaginations just spiral with the consequences. Right? It changes everything. It changes our finances and our family and our relationships and our joy and our enjoyment and our prospects and our jobs and our careers and our career arcs, and it just changes everything. And all of a sudden, we make the wrong choice, and in our heads, we're like now destitute and hopeless because we made the wrong choice. So what if we do? Like, how do we even make a decision? I mean, I think most of us wonder, like if God loves me and has a wonderful plan for my life, then why doesn't he just tell me what it is? Right? Like, I mean, if he really loved me, if he really had a plan, like, why doesn't he just let me know? Because then I can make the right decisions to make it happen. Right? That if he has a wonderful plan, then I need to know what it is. Otherwise, I might make the wrong choice and I might be like go astray from this wonderful plan he apparently has. It's because we assume that in every decision in life, there are simply right decisions and wrong decisions. So we stress out about them. We try to do everything we can to make sure we're making the right decisions. We make pro and con lists, right? Long pro and con lists. We look for signs in all sorts of strange places. Right, we try to interpret our emotional desires and learnings and leanings. But the problem is, no matter how much we try to figure it all out, none of it ever gives us any ultimate confidence or the confidence we long for. Like we just end up stressed out, anxious, constantly worried that we're making the wrong choices. And it doesn't matter. Like we can make a longer and a longer and a longer pro and con sheet. Or we can look for more and more and more signs. Or we can try to figure out, like, if the emotional leading in us is leading us in a certain direction, and then we're like, well, maybe it's leading me in this way, and we're like, well, maybe that's God, or maybe it's Satan. Like, how do I know? Like, what do I do? Like, are my pros and cons the right pros and cons? Like, what if I'm forgetting some? What if I leave some off? And it never actually leads to peace. And I think, this dynamic has existed throughout the whole history of humanity. We have this fear when it comes to decisions. It obviously took place at the time of the preacher, but I think this has only gotten more and more magnified today. I think we live in a world where we have more decisions to make than people have ever had in the history of the world. There's things we have to make decisions about that, like, no one's ever had to make decisions about that before. Like, there was just one option. You just did it. But we are given a choice, right? From every big thing to every small thing. And it's not just the big things we stress out about. We stress out about the big things. We also stress out about the small things, right? And there are so many small things. Like, just think about peanut butter, right? Like you have to make an informed choice about peanut butter, right? And the choice between smooth and crunchy is just the start, right? First, you got to choose between smooth and crunchy, but then you got to decide whether it's smooth or crunchy, if it's organic or like the regular. All right, so smooth and crunchy, organic or the regular, and then you have to decide if it's like name brand or like generic. Right? So smooth or crunchy, organic or regular, like name brand or generic, and then you've got to decide, like, take all this into the decision of how expensive it is, right? And everything's priced at, like, the maddening point, right? The exact right price point that makes you go, I have no idea if that's worth that, right? Like, I guess maybe it's worth that. I guess, like, that's a lot more. Like, maybe I don't know how to do this. And that is just at pavilions. Right? Like, you get some different choices if you go to Ralph's, and you get even more different choices if you go to Trader Joe's, and even more different choices if you go to Sprouts, and even more different choices if you go to Whole Foods. Like, and you get more choices if you go to Amazon, right? Like, all of a sudden, you've got all, and so you got to choose about where to go, you got to choose, and that's just, you don't even have any jelly yet, right? So you got to make all the choices about peanut butter, and then you got to make all the choices about jelly, and you still don't have anything to put them on, right? So then you got to make all the choices about, and this is just to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Everything requires these decisions, and the world in which we live, the culture in which we live, keeps echoing to us that these informed decisions are important. And they repeat to us the danger that might come if we make the wrong one, right? Your health is at stake. Your future is at stake. Your financial security is at stake. Your kids are at stake. Like the expectations you're establishing for your kids that are going to affect them their whole lives is at stake with every choice. No wonder we're so stressed out. No wonder we're so anxious. No wonder we don't know what to do. But as I mentioned, we're going to hear three pieces of very practical instruction in our passage today. And the first, into all this just maddening decision-making, the preacher says, wait, don't be afraid. Fear is not how you can best make these decisions. He says in verse 1, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on the earth. So he says life is risky. Life is risky, and there's no way of changing it. There's no way of avoiding the risk. There's no decision you can make that can get you out of the risk. Life just has risk. And so wisdom suggests that we don't run from the risk and fear, but we embrace it, right? You do things like cast your bread on the waters, right? Like fill the tub, put the loaf in there, and see which one floats. And then, that's not what he's talking about. So somebody after 11 o'clock service was like, when I think about like cast your bread on the waters, I just think of like that's something a duck would say. Like to you, like standing on the, hey, cast your bread on the waters, right? It's not what he's saying either. This is an analogy. He's referring to trade. He's referring to maritime trade. He's saying take your crop and put it on a ship and trade it. Because yes, there's risk, but you know what? There's risk in trading it, and there's also risk in hoarding it. And you can't avoid risk. So you may as well put it on the ship, and you may as well send it off, and hopefully it'll come back with something else, right? In a little while, it'll come back with, something it got traded for. But and just think about what that was like. Think about that type of decision. Right? Most of us, and not all of us, but most of us have the luxury of like getting a paycheck. Right? And some of you get paid differently, right? But think about taking an entire year's work. Like you don't get paid along the way. You take an entire year's work and assuming that there was no hailstorm, assuming that there was no drought, assuming that the bugs didn't destroy the crop, assuming that it was actually a successful crop, assuming you actually had the manpower to harvest the crop, you take the vast majority of that year's work and you put it on a ship. And not like a metal or steel ship like the ones we use, right? Like a wooden, hand-built boat, essentially. And you watch your year's work disappear over the horizon. Like, you want to talk about reasons to be anxious. But the preacher says, you know what? Cast your bread on the waters. It'll come back. Like, this is you can't avoid risk. Like, don't be so afraid that you don't do it. It's going to happen. But, he goes on in verse 2, he says, but give a portion to 7 or even to 8, right? Like, but don't put it all on one boat, right? Do 7 different things with it, right? Like send some of it over on the boat, send some of it on another boat, trade some of it locally, like keep some of it in your barn, do 7 different things with it, or even better, do 8 different things with it, right? Because you know what? You don't know when the disaster is going to happen, and it will. Like bad things are going to happen, and you don't know how to manage it. Right? It says, for you do not know the disaster that may happen on the earth. So, in a sense, diversify. Right? Like, diversify what you do because you can't control it and you can't make it not risky. So, just do it a number of different ways. Do it wisely. And this is meant to be advice for all of life. In one sense, I think he says, don't be afraid of risk in business. Just diversify the risk. But also, don't be afraid of risk in your generosity. Like, when you're being generous and you don't know what kind of impact that's going to have. But diversify the risk. Just be broadly generous. Don't be afraid of how you're going to use your energy or your time. Or okay, I got to make sure I use it the most. You don't know what the best way is. You don't even know what the most efficient way is. You don't know what's going to produce the most out of your time or your energy, even your care for others. So just diversify. It's going to be risky. And see what God does with it. Because whatever is going to happen, it's going to happen. And you don't know what's going to happen. And you not only don't you know what's going to happen, you can't know what's going to happen. Here he says in verse 3, if the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth, right? If there's rain in the clouds, it's going to rain. And if a tree falls, it's going to fall. And if it falls to the north, it falls to the north. And you know where it's going to lie? To the north. And you know what? You can't do anything about it. When the tree falls, when the rain comes, you can't predict it. You can't control it. If it's going to rain, it's going to rain. If the tree's going to fall, it's going to fall. You can't predict it. You can't control it. So don't try to, but just recognize that there is most of what's going to go on in this world that is completely not only out of your control, but even out of your prediction. Which is why he goes on in verse 4, he who observes the wind will not sow. He who regards the clouds will not reap. He says, if you spend your time trying to predict it and waiting until the coast is clear, waiting until it all is ready, he's like, you're not going to do anything. He says, because it's never going to be just right. You can't predict and control the outcome of business. You can't predict and control the ultimate impact of your generosity. You can't control or predict the efficacy or efficiency of your energy or your time. He says, so don't obsess about trying to figure out what's going to happen. Don't try to nail down your predictions and therefore make decisions. Because life isn't predictable. It's risky. And when we depend too heavily on our own predictions, it leads to inaction. Our lack of certainty paralyzes us. And those predictions, he says, really, that obsession with trying to predict things, he's like, that's not wisdom. He says, that's fear. We try to predict, we try to know, we try to figure it out because we're afraid. He says, and fear doesn't make good choices. Fear isn't the way to make good decisions. Fear produces indecision. Wisdom doesn't come from being afraid of making the wrong decisions. Wisdom comes from bold love, not fear. And Jesus himself actually warned against this kind of fear-based inaction, fascinatingly, in the parable of the talents. It's a powerful parable that oftentimes, I think, sometimes we don't quite know what to do with. Right? There's a man, and he gives 5 talents to one of his servants, and he gives 2 talents to another one of his servants, and he gives 1 talent to another one of his servants, and then he goes away. And then we pick up the story when he comes back. We see in Matthew chapter 25, starting with verse 14. He says, now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing him 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I made 5 talents more. And his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents, and here I made you 2 talents more. And his master said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So, he says, I was afraid. Because I made my decision out of fear. And I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground, and here you have what's yours. But his master answered him, you wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents, for to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. See, this is what we all long to hear, right? I mean, if you are a follower of Christ, what we long to hear one day, but when we step into the grace before our King, simply for him to say, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. And if we see this, what inspired that response? It wasn't perfection. It wasn't making all the right choices. What inspired that response was simply action, just doing something, a willingness of the servant to faithfully use what God had entrusted to him. It wasn't the result of making all the right choices. It wasn't the result of making perfect choices. It wasn't the result of making the conservative, fear-based choices. And he didn't expect the one who was given 5 talents to make 50 talents. And he didn't expect the one who was given 2 talents to make the 5 talents. So it wasn't even about comparison. I don't even think he was convinced, or I'm not even sure he wanted the one with 1 talent to produce an entire another talent. He just wanted him to do something. He said, put it in the bank. I mean, what does that give us, like 1%? Right? At least that's what it gives us, right? So, like, what he's like, so I would have at least liked to have gotten like a talent, and a cent. If a talent's worth $1, it's not, but you get the point, right? Like, his point was that because you were afraid, you were disobedient. Because you were afraid, it stopped you from doing anything. And so he rebukes the fear-riddled servant who didn't do anything, which leads us, I think, to the second part of our passage. He says the first instruction, he says, don't be afraid, but just do something. Just do something. A few weeks ago, I talked about God's secret will, right? And we read the quote from Paul Tripp. He says, God's secret will is called his secret will because it's secret, right? Like, it's the whole point. If we found out what his secret will was, it wouldn't be his secret will anymore, right? Like, I try to explain the nature of secrets to my kids, too, right? Like no, if I know it, then it's not a secret, right? The whole point of his secret will is that these are the things that he knows that we don't. And we talked about how God's secret will is his secret will, not because he doesn't care about us, not because he's trying to withhold from us. It's his secret will because it's the aspect of his will that we simply can't comprehend. It is beyond our comprehension. Like, we can't even comprehend how God relates, even just relates to time and space, let alone how he works in it and how he's working it all out for his glory. Right? If you weren't here, I compared it to trying to explain quantum physics to a 5-year-old. Right? We just don't have the capacity to understand. And when it comes to God's secret will, we don't have the capacity to understand how he is working and how he controls things and everything in his eternal mind. We can't know God's secret will, so we shouldn't try to figure it out. But what God has given to us is his revealed will. Right? His revealed will, it's not that he hasn't given us any of his will. He's given us a lot of his will, and he's revealed to us in his word what his will is for us, the things he wants us to know, the things he knows are most important. But the problem is we too often reverse the two. Right? Instead of like saying, you know what, I can't know your secret will, so I don't need to worry about it, but I can know your revealed will, and so I'm trying to figure that out as best I can, we reverse the two. And we're like, I'm just trying to figure out your secret will, and your revealed will, I just ignore. Right? Oh, don't worry about what you said there. I just want to know the mystery part. Our passage continues in verse 5, where the preacher writes, as you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman, try saying that 10 times fast, womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. You see, God's revealed will is something we are to know and obey. And God's secret will is something we can't know. And therefore, it's not our responsibility to obey because we can't know it. But I think too often we try to know God's secret will and we neglect his revealed will. Right? He says, you don't know how the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman. So you're not since you can't know that, you're not responsible for making it happen. Right? I mean, imagine a pregnant woman who was just stressed out. She's like, I know there's a baby growing in me, but I don't know how to get the spirit inside of it. Right? I don't know how to get the soul inside. Or even just think about like the heartbeat, right? I mean, like a heartbeat, this is still like just one of the most insane things about life that we just don't even begin to comprehend. Like, how does a bunch of cells that are multiplying, all of a sudden start beating? Right? Like, what happens there? We don't know. Like, nobody knows. There's not a human on earth that knows how that happens. But what if you're like, oh, but I'm just so worried. Like, I've got to try to sit the right way. I got to try to like eat the right food. I got to try to like have the right conversations. I got to like sleep the right amount of time so that the heart starts beating. Right? We're like, wait, no. That's not your job. Right? We don't even know how to do that, let alone like you being responsible for it. Like, that's not your job, right? Or a couple who's like, well, we keep putting off kids because we've Googled it, and we don't know how to start that heart. And you're like, wait, you're confused. That's not your responsibility. Right? That's not for you to do. But I'm afraid this is the type of thing we do so often. We get sidetracked by the fact that we don't know God's secret will. and we don't end up doing anything. We try to figure it out. We're like, how do I control this? How do I make this happen? How do I make sure that I know and understand what the right decision is? And God's like, wait, no, that's not yours to know. That's not your responsibility. Or we decide that since we can't know his secret will, then we don't need to know his will at all, and we deny his revealed will as well. We're like, I'll just do what I want. But this isn't what God's after either. Because there is an aspect of God's will that he has given to us and that he does want us to understand. He wants us to understand his revealed will, and he's given us a lot about his will in his word. He gives us specific aspects of his will that we are called to know, about who he is, about who we are, about how the world functions, about the fact that we've been adopted, about the fact that we've been redeemed, about the fact that we're his children. He wants us to know these things. He also gives us specific aspects of his will that we're to do. Right? He tells us and there's things we can know we're to do. He says we are to care for the marginalized and the poor. We are to be kind and compassionate to one another. We are to love the Lord our God with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength. There's things about his will that he's revealed that we know we're supposed to do. And he also gives specific aspects of his will that we're not to do. Right? We shouldn't kill each other. Right? We shouldn't engage in sexual activity outside of the covenant of biblical marriage. We shouldn't steal from one another. We shouldn't oppress one another. Right? So there's things we are to know, and there's things we're to do, and there's things we're not to do. It's all revealed in his word. He tells us these things. And not only that, but he also gives us principles, just general principles that guide how we act and live. He tells us things like, your speech should be used for building up, not tearing down. He tells us that we should consider others better than ourselves, more important than ourselves. He tells us that we should live our lives generous and ready to share. He gives us all these different principles that guide us as well. But when it comes to any decision in life, big or small, God's revealed will gives us clear and unambiguous parameters. It's not just like do anything you want. It's not just like do whatever you'd like. He says, no, there's parameters here, things that you're supposed to know, things you're supposed to do, things you're supposed to not do, and some principles to guide you along the way. But even with all of that guidance, God still often doesn't tell us exactly what we're to do in every different situation. Even within all of those parameters, within all of those principles, there still exists this freedom. He gives us this freedom and says, I want you to be guided by wisdom and just make the best choice you can. Which job to take, where to live, what to do this weekend, how long to stay at work, what to make for dinner, right? And this is where wisdom comes in. Wisdom comes in to help guide us in the choices we make. And wisdom doesn't always give us a clear, X, Y, or Z, but it does help guide us in the right direction. And here in our passage today, the wisdom we get is simply, he says, and in the midst of that, here's wisdom to help guide you in that decision making. He says, just do something. Don't let fear paralyze you. But make a decision and live it out. Make a decision and fully engage in it. He says, whatever you do, don't do nothing. He says, in the morning, sow your seed, and at evening, withhold not your hand, for you don't know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. He says you can't wait to know the outcome in order to sow your seed. He says, if you wait to know the outcome, you're never going to sow. And the one way to guarantee you don't have a crop is to not sow the seed. Right? He says, what I want you to do is I just simply want you to give me an opportunity to produce you a crop. But to have for him to have the possibility of producing a crop, you have to sow the seed. And so he says, you do your part and then don't worry about the outcome. Just do something. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul uses the same logic in order to encourage generosity. He says this isn't just about like business or work. He says this is about being generous as well. He says, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Whoever sows generously will also reap generously. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. See, look, he says, let God multiply. He says, if you are generous in your sowing, God will multiply the harvest. And it might be the harvest of the success you're looking for, and it might not be, but what it definitely will be is the harvest of your righteousness. And you know what? That righteousness, that eternal work that God is doing in you is the one thing in this world that won't fade. Right? Everything else, whatever career you build, like it's going to vanish. Whatever company you establish, it's not going to be here forever. Right? We've been learning that all through Ecclesiastes. This all vanishes, but the harvest of your righteousness does not. So he says, do something. Be generous. Live out the life that you know God has called you to do. Don't be paralyzed by overanalyzing every decision. You know God's called you to work hard. You know God's called you to love others. You know God's called you to be generous. So just do something. Do that. You don't have to figure it all out. You don't have to figure out life. You don't have to understand everything and analyze everything and every possible outcome because you can't. And I'm afraid that sometimes when we try to analyze everything and control everything, we make decisions based on the delusion that we actually are in more control than we think we are. We're like, okay, I can make this decision because I know that by making this decision, it'll change the world. And God's like, yeah, probably not. Right? He's like, I can change the world. And what I want from you is to do something, right? Is to be a part of this. And I want to use you in the incredible work I'm doing in the world. But you know what? It's not because you make the right decision or the wrong decision. He's like, yes, use my parameters. Yes, use my principles. Yes, allow that to guide you. But then, don't be afraid. Just do something. So which job should you take? Well, what biblical commands commend it? What do any biblical commands forbid it? What biblical principles can guide it? What does biblical wisdom suggest? And then just pick one. Or what should you do with your end of the year bonus? There's all sorts of different things you could do with your end of the year bonus, right? What biblical commands commend it? Are there any things that biblical commands forbid? What biblical principles might help guide it? And what does wisdom suggest? And then just do something. Or even just, what should you do next weekend? Well, are there any biblical commands that forbid what you want to do next weekend? Are there any commands that suggest what you should do, what you definitely should do next weekend? Are there biblical principles that can guide it? What seems biblically wise? And then don't be afraid. Just do something. I'm afraid that sometimes we can take ourselves and our decisions a little bit too seriously. And this is what leads to our fear. We think a little bit too highly of ourselves or the longevity or the impact of this decision. Like, this is going to make or break my life. And again, God's like, yeah, probably not. Like, I do. I love you, and I've got a wonderful plan for your life. Like, you can't mess that up. Like, this isn't going to blow it. This isn't going to, ruin everything. Like, yes, be wise. Do your due diligence. But don't be afraid. He says, I want you to be wise. I want you to obey. But I don't want you to be afraid. As we read back in chapter 9, verse 10, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. And this is where he's saying, don't be afraid, just do something. And when you do something, when you make a decision, then just pour yourself into it. You don't have to spend your entire time second guessing whether, I'm here now, but was it the right choice? I'm doing this now, but is this actually what I should have been doing? Right? We can ruin so many of the good gifts that God's given us. Because we just fill them with fear and second guessing and insecurity. And he's like, whoa, that's not why I gave that to you. That's not why I called you to that. Don't be afraid, just do something. And the result is, he said, and lastly, enjoy life. God wants you to enjoy life. He says in verses 7 and 8, light is sweet, and it's pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many, and all that comes is vanity. See, this is interesting, even as he references the sun here, because we've been hearing, and I think this is kind of a reflection as he's beginning to look back over everything else he's written in Ecclesiastes. And all through Ecclesiastes, we've heard about the sun over and over, right? We've heard about everything that's under the sun. And everything under the sun, we've learned, is vanity, right? Everything under the sun is fleeting. Everything under the sun is there for a moment, and then it's gone. And that's all true. He says, but it's also kind of nice to see the sun. Like, yeah, it's fleeting. Yeah, it's there for a moment. It's going to be gone. Yeah, it's not going to last. But while it's there, it's kind of nice. And while it's there, you should enjoy it. Don't try to cling to it. Don't try to keep it. Don't try to control it. Don't try to manipulate it. Don't try to maintain it. But do enjoy it. He's looking back at everything. He's saying, in summary, life's a gift. It's not gain, right? It doesn't last. Death does end it. Like all things come to an end. It's there for a moment and it's gone. But for the moment it's there, it's a gift. And this is one of the reasons I find the book of Ecclesiastes so incredibly refreshing. So incredibly freeing. It peels back our illusion of control. It peels back the facades that we so constantly create, trying to justify our own actions or justify our decisions. It forces us to look at the reality of life, and it forces us to look at the reality of death. And it forces us to look at how temporary and fleeting much of life is. And it forces us to recognize just how powerless we are. And when we see all of that, when we see the world for what it really is, it's freeing. Because it's exhausting trying to be God. Right? Like when we try to control things, when we try to figure it all out, when we try to hold it in our hands and it just slips away, like, it's exhausting. And there is nothing that makes life more miserable than trying to be Him when we were never created to be. But when we realize that God truly is in control, that there's much of life we simply can't figure out, and that the things in this world are fading, it frees us to actually enjoy the gift He gives. So if a person lives many years, he writes, let him rejoice in them all. Life is a gift. And like every day is a gift. And I mean that not in like the Hallmark way, right? Like, yeah, I think I read that like on a bumper sticker or something like that. Like it's cheesy. And like, no. Like I mean that in the sense that there is a giver, a literal giver, who in His beautiful sovereign plan for all of creation and for all of time and for all the world has chosen to give you today. You didn't earn it. There's nothing you could do for it. You couldn't make it happen. He chose to give you today. Every day is a gift. Every week's a gift. Every year is a gift. And that's not just, again, some sentimental reality, but the fact that life is a gift has been given so that we might enjoy it. Paul reminded Timothy of the same thing. As he says in 1 Timothy 6, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. He says, He says, charge them, don't set their hopes on riches. Those things fade. He says, set their hopes on God. But because God gives us everything to be generous with, he talks about that in 1 Timothy 6 as well. He says, and to enjoy. God wants you to enjoy life. Because it's a gift that comes with all sorts of blessings. Friendship and beauty and generosity and the ability to be generous and laughter. But the enjoyment of life, I think this is where we sometimes miss it. The enjoyment of life is not predicated on the absence of suffering. I think we're like, okay, I'll enjoy life as long as I can control it and make sure suffering doesn't happen. He's like, oh, no, that's not how it works. Like, suffering happens. We're in a fallen world. Like, it's there. He says, so let them enjoy life. And he says, but let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. There's going to be days of darkness, but knowing that there's going to be days of darkness and knowing that there's nothing you can do about it actually frees you to enjoy the gifts as you have them. Because you don't have to be constantly trying to keep it all at bay. You don't have to be constantly trying to avoid the days of darkness. You don't constantly have to be trying to control things so the days of darkness don't come. He's like, no, they'll come. Like, they do come. That's life in a fallen world. But when they come, it's not because you should have been more fearful in your decision making and you weren't afraid enough. It's not because you should have done this instead of that. It's not because you should have been here instead of there. It's because days of darkness come as a part of our fallen world. And the fact that they come means you don't have to try to spend your entire life doing everything possible to avoid them. You don't have to try to control things. You don't have to figure everything out. And so you're freed from all of that fear. You're freed from all that just trying to be God to actually enjoy the enjoyable parts of life. Because too often we do ruin the enjoyable parts of life by constantly worrying about them. Trying to, if they're not there, trying to get them to come back. If they're there, trying to make sure they stay. He says, but no, that's not how we enjoy. So where does this kind of freedom come from as we close? Ultimately, it comes from an eternal perspective. And it came in part for the preacher. But for us, this eternal perspective and the reality of this freedom comes in full because of the person and work of Jesus. Right? See, to be at peace, to actually be able to enjoy life, we have to remember not only that God's in control, but also that he loves us. Right? Just the fact that God's in control isn't freeing if we don't know he loves us. But when you put the two together, it frees us from the fear so we can embrace the beautiful life that God gives each one of us. And the reason we can know that he loves us, he tells us in 1 John 4. In this, the love of God was made manifest in us, among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love. Not that we've loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation, to send his Son to be the substitute, sent his Son to be the atonement for our sins. He goes on in verse 18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love, it casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. See, this is why we still fear. Because we haven't been perfected in love yet. But we're being perfected. We're continually being perfected and loved. We are loved, and so be reminded of Christ's love. Be reminded of what he gave up for us. Be reminded of the fact that he took the wrath of God on himself for you. He loves you so much. Like, how will he not also with Christ give us all things? He loves us and cares for us so that our decisions no longer have to be captivated by fear. So, in closing, what about you? What are the fears that paralyze you? What are the decisions that you have the hardest time making? And God wants to remind us of all of his love and the magnitude of his glorious love in Christ. And call us to not be afraid, but to just do something and enjoy life. Let me pray. Heavenly Father,
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.